Imagine being a small, poor foreign boy constantly humiliated by others, and one day making kings kneel before you. Imagine leaving a forgotten island in the Mediterranean and eventually dominating almost all of Europe, dragging the world into endless war. Napoleon Bonaparte was not born powerful. He was not born admired. In fact, many people considered him strange, arrogant, and incapable of leading anything. But inside that young man lived an ambition so enormous that it would change human history forever. And perhaps the most terrifying part is this: the more power Napoleon gained, the more he began believing he was invincible. Because before the epic battles, before the crowns, before millions of soldiers marched in his name, there was only a boy trying to prove to the world that he was not insignificant. Napoleon was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, shortly after the territory had been taken by France. His family was not rich, and worse, the French saw them as foreigners. From childhood, Napoleon grew up hearing insults about his strange accent and humble background. When he was sent to military schools in France, things became even worse. The other students constantly mocked him. They called him poor, strange, a savage Corsican. Imagine the impact that had on a young boy, alone and far from his family. While other students came from wealthy, noble families, Napoleon barely had enough money to eat properly. He spent hours isolated, obsessively reading books about war, empires, and the greatest conquerors in history. And it was there that something began growing inside him, an enormous hunger for power. Napoleon did not just want respect, he wanted to conquer the world. While other young men dreamed about wealth or romance, Napoleon studied ancient battles as if preparing for something much greater. Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, Hannibal. He admired men who changed history through force. But nobody imagined that quiet boy would become even more dangerous. Then France collapsed. The French Revolution exploded. The people rose up. Kings were overthrown. Heads rolled beneath guillotines. The streets were drowning in chaos, blood, and fear. And it was in the middle of that nightmare that Napoleon saw his opportunity. While many officers hesitated, he acted quickly. His military intelligence started attracting attention. Napoleon understood something few others realized. Speed could destroy larger armies. He moved troops rapidly, attacked unexpectedly, and confused enemies far more powerful than himself. Then came the first major explosion of his career. In 1793, during the siege of Toulon, Napoleon created a brilliant plan to defeat enemy forces, and it worked perfectly. Suddenly, that unknown young officer became a national hero. He was only 24 years old. But his ambition was just beginning. Soon after, Paris descended into chaos once again. Rebels threatened to overthrow the revolutionary government. Many leaders were terrified. Napoleon was not. He ordered cannons fired directly into the crowd. The attack was brutal, fast, violent, and it worked. The rebellion was crushed. At that moment, France realized something frightening. Napoleon was willing to do absolutely anything to win. And the most shocking part, people began admiring him precisely because of it. Then came the Italian campaign, and that was when Napoleon stopped being merely a talented general and became a legend. The French army was starving, poorly equipped, and demoralized. Many believed victory was impossible, but Napoleon looked at those exhausted soldiers and made outrageous promises. He promised glory, wealth, victory, and somehow They believed him. Napoleon stayed close to his troops. He walked among them, spoke directly to ordinary soldiers, and that created a powerful connection. His men were not only fighting for France anymore, they were fighting for Napoleon. Then the victories began, one after another, fast, humiliating, brilliant. Larger armies were destroyed by strategies that seemed almost impossible. Napoleon's name spread fear across all of Europe. Kings were terrified. Emperors watched nervously, because a new type of leader had appeared, a man who seemed impossible to stop. Then Napoleon did something even more daring. He returned to France as an absolute hero. People idolized him. His face was everywhere. And slowly he realized he had enough power to control not only armies, but the entire country. Then came the coup, 1799. Napoleon overthrew the French government, almost without resistance, almost effortlessly, and became the most powerful man in France. But that was not enough for him. It was never enough. Because Napoleon did not simply want to rule, he wanted immortality. In 1804, before thousands of people, one of the most symbolic moments in history took place. Napoleon decided to crown himself Emperor of France. But there is one shocking detail. Traditionally, the Pope placed the crown upon the king's head. Napoleon grabbed the crown himself and placed it on his own head. It was as if he were telling the world, "My power comes from me." In that moment, the poor and humiliated boy from Corsica had become the most powerful man in Europe. And then the real storm began. Napoleon launched massive wars against nearly every major European nation, and the most unbelievable part is this: he kept winning. Austria, Prussia, Russia, one after another. Napoleon's battles seemed impossible. His movements were too fast. His enemies often did not even understand what was happening until they were already defeated. Then came Austerlitz, perhaps his greatest military masterpiece. Napoleon faced much larger forces. Many believed he would finally lose, but everything was part of his plan. He pretended weakness, lured the enemy forward, waited for the perfect moment, and then attacked. The result was devastating. Thousands of enemy soldiers died or fled. Emperors were humiliated. Europe stood shocked. At that moment, Napoleon seemed invincible. But that is exactly where great stories begin collapsing, because absolute power changes people. And slowly, Napoleon began believing he could never lose. He controlled nations, placed relatives on thrones, redrew borders, decided the fate of millions. But a massive problem was growing silently. The entire world was beginning to hate him. Country after country united against France. Endless wars destroyed economies. Thousands kept dying constantly. And while Napoleon expanded his empire, he was also creating enemies everywhere. Then he made the decision that destroyed everything, invading Russia, 1812. More than 600,000 soldiers marched with Napoleon into Russian territory. It was one of the largest armies in history, but the Russians created a cruel strategy. They kept retreating, burning everything behind them. Food destroyed, cities burned, nothing left for the French to use. Then winter arrived, and hell began. Extreme cold, starvation, disease, soldiers freezing to death, dead horses scattered across the snow. The most powerful army in the world slowly began disappearing. Men went insane from desperation. Some froze while sleeping. Others committed suicide. And Napoleon watched everything collapse around him. When he finally left Russia, only a small fraction of his army remained alive. It was a complete disaster. And for the first time, Napoleon's enemies realized something. He could bleed. Then all of Europe turned against him. The defeats began, one after another, faster than the victories, until Paris fell. Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne. The man who had nearly conquered the world was now a prisoner on a tiny island called Elba. It seemed like the end. But Napoleon still had one final act left, and perhaps it was the most unbelievable of all. Less than a year later, he escaped from the island, alone, with barely any soldiers, and returned to France. Now imagine this scene. The French government sends troops to arrest him. Napoleon walks alone toward the enemy soldiers, opens his coat, and says, "If any of you wishes to kill your emperor, here I am." Silence, tension, and then the soldiers begin shouting, "Long live Napoleon!" Instead of arresting him, they joined him. It became one of the most unbelievable moments in history. Napoleon regained power without practically firing a single shot, but the world would never allow that to happen again. Then came Waterloo, the final battle, rain, mud, explosions, thousands of men dying. Napoleon fought desperately to regain control, but this time the mistakes were fatal. His enemies were prepared, and then it happened. Napoleon was defeated, truly defeated. No comeback, no miracle, no escape. This time he was sent to a distant island called St. Helena, lost in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and there, alone, isolated, watching the world continue without him. Napoleon spent his final years. The man who nearly conquered Europe now walked slowly beside the sea, surrounded only by memories of battles, glory, and destruction. Napoleon died in 1821, but his story never died. Because even today the world remains fascinated by him. Some call him a genius, others call him a tyrant, some see a hero, others see a monster. But there is one thing nobody can deny. Napoleon Bonaparte changed the world. And perhaps his story remains so powerful because it reveals something frightening about human nature. The line between genius and obsession may be far thinner than we imagine. Now tell me something. Do you think Napoleon was a brilliant hero or a man consumed by his own ambition? Comment below because I really want to hear your opinion. And if you enjoy real stories more intense than movies, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the next story will surprise you even more.